My name is Rebecca Bowling, and I am the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities. And I would like to welcome you to our first Humanities event of the new school year. We actually have 2 more events in the next 2 weeks, so let me tell you about them briefly. On Monday, this coming Monday, September 20th at 4 p.m., back here on the 7th floor, 2 journalists from the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, Claudia Dreyfus and Andrew Hacker, will be speaking on higher education, some pertinent and impertinent questions about the value students and families receive for their college investment. In other words, is it worth the money? In their research, they concluded that UMBC was one of the top 10 schools with quality teaching research at the undergraduate level, and needless to say, they're being welcomed here. So I hope that you will be here to meet them. Then on Monday the 29th, downstairs in the library gallery, visual arts and experimental filmmaker Fred Warden will be speaking on After Hours in the Cerebral Kitchen, experimental filmmaking in the 21st century. He'll also be showing one of his own shorter films. So please join us for these events and pick up a Humanities board on your way out. There's several on the table where the books are prepared. I also want to draw your attention to a event this coming Friday, so 2 days from today, at 2:30 on the site of the new building construction. I'm sure all of you have noticed it probably affected your parking, for one thing. We're building a new Performing Arts and Humanities building. It started this summer, and the official groundbreaking is this Friday at 2:30. The executive, the governor, several members of the Board of Regents are all going to be here for the event. The Drescher Center and the Humanities Linehan Scholars Program will have a study room in that building, a seminar room, and of course several of the humanities disciplines. But we really want it to be a limelight, a beacon for the humanities and the performing arts on campus. It's going to hold a key position on the campus, and the Drescher Center will have a key position, lots of glass windows. Those of you who have been in the current Drescher Center know that we're a pretty small space in the library over by the Honors College, and you have to look pretty hard to find a window. So we're really looking forward to this. This new building is a very big deal, and we are especially grateful to the Governor and the Legislature of Maryland and President Dabrowski for their continued support of the building. We expect it to give the humanities and the performing arts the limelight that they deserve on this campus. There will also be a reception. So I ask you to help show these various VIPs and the campus as a whole how much we welcome having a new Performing Arts and Humanities building. And now, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our speaker tonight, Steve Luxenberg, an associate editor at the Washington Post, who has worked for more than 30 years as a newspaper editor and reporter. I also want to thank the Retriever weekly student newspaper for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture. Steve's journalistic career began here in Baltimore at the Baltimore Sun, where he worked for 11 years. He joined the Washington Post in 1985 as deputy editor of the newspaper's investigative special project staff, headed by assistant managing editor Woodward. In 1991, he succeeded Woodward as head of this investigative staff. In his current role as a Post associate editor focusing on special projects, Steve has directed coverage of in-depth stories on the causes and consequences of the financial crisis that unfolded in the fall of 2008, and which, of course, we're still in the midst of. Steve has given talks and workshops about journalism issues and nonfiction writing at universities and discussion forums, and has made occasional guest appearances on radio and television shows, including The Wire, for those of you who are aficionados of The Wire, to discuss the media. In February 2008, he joined 6 others at Boston's Stoop storytelling series for a night of stories involving secrets. I listened to his story, drawn from his book, Anti-Ghost, which we'll be talking about here tonight. And even if you have not yet read his book, I can tell you we are in for a fascinating talk. Steve grew up in Detroit, where Annie's Ghost primarily takes place. He is married to a school librarian and has 2 grown children. He is, of course, the author of this prize-winning book about his own family. And I I just want to read you a couple of excerpts from a few quotes from reviews of his book. Beautifully complex, raw, and revealing. A wise, affecting new memoir, full of empathy and sorrowful truth. A fascinating account of a life lived in shadows. A story as compelling as anything found in fiction. A moving testament to the ties that bind families. Unforgettable. When Steve and I first discussed what he wanted to do this evening here at UMBC, he made it clear he did not want to do a traditional reading. Instead, he offered me a panoply of related issues he was interested in talking about. Family roots, the consequences of secrecy, the importance of identity, the history of mental health treatment in the United States, writing memoirs, the difficulties that memory imposes in reconstructing events, and the challenges that a nonfiction writer has in keeping the story true. Needless to say, we can't expect him to do all this tonight. But just to set the stage of his talk, I would like to read the suspenseful first lines of his book. The secret emerged without warning or provocation on an ordinary afternoon in 1995. Secrets, I've discovered, have a way of working themselves free of their keepers. The UMBC bookstore has copies of the paperback version of the book, which the author has graciously offered to sign after his talk, and we will also have a small reception. I know I'm anxious to get my copy signed. So please join me in welcoming Steve Luxenberg. Head start.
So what that just proved is that I couldn't make up my mind when she asked me what to do. Her reference to The Wire, I'm actually on episode 3 of season 5, if you're looking to get the DVD box set. And I can recreate for you my cameo appearance if you'd like. You ready? You ready? That's it. 3 seconds of fame. But you know, in 35 years of being a journalist, I have had more people tell me, I saw you on The Wire, than told me I read your stories. So we all know about that kind of fame. I don't like readings because I think people are prone to walk out. So I'm going to not do that kind of a talk. I will say, though, since that announcement was not made, anybody have one of these? Please leave it on. I want you to tweet, I want you to text, I want you to tell everybody how great a book this is. Now, like a little marketing ploy, it's because my father was a furniture salesman, and he was worried that his writer intellectual son would make a living. So I'm glad to let him know that I've gotten in touch with my inner marketer. You see, he wasn't worried I wasn't going to make a living because he knew how hard it was to make one. He worked on commission. And commission is not a fun way to have a job from week to week. So I was glad when I got a job at a newspaper and I got a salary and a pension plan. And then I decided a couple of years ago to go into the book writing field, where they have something similar to a commission, except they call it something fancy, a royalty. But in fact, it's very much the same system. And so now I feel like I've made it to where my father was, and he'll be very pleased to know that. Of course, I thought being in newspapers was something that would be something solid that you could hold in your hands, and you would never have to be worried about having a job. But of course, the New York Times just told a publisher in London that they were going to stop printing that solid thing in about 5 years. That's how much things have changed. You know, there's a lot of benefits to being a book writer. And I don't mean seeing your book on the remainder table. As a journalist, you're not allowed to join any groups. You have to remain neutral. So when I became a book writer, I suddenly had to join a group. It's a group with a shared purpose, which is to look at your Amazon rating every hour. And the Writers Guild has a helpline if you look at it often than that, which I've only called twice. I'm going to do slides tonight, but I'm not going to, the point of the talk isn't the slides. It isn't the PowerPoint. It's me. So don't think that this is going to keep changing, because it's not until about halfway through my talk. And I will take questions, of course, and we'll have a good discussion, I hope. I will not require anyone to reveal their family secrets, but if you would like to, you're welcome to. I want to talk a bit about stories and how we tell them. You know, we live in an age that craves narrative, and yet at the same time, we also crave authenticity. And sometimes those two things are in conflict. It's a bit dangerous, as memoir writers like James Fry found out. Everyone know who James Fry is? He wrote a memoir about, 6 or 7 years ago that was turned out to be really embellished. And he was on Oprah when the memoir came out and got quite famous, and then he had to admit that a lot of it was made up. This has made it harder for memoir writers like me, who think that perhaps truth is more important than embellishment. Every story has to begin somewhere. And we often, you often get the advice when you're younger in middle school or high school, start at the beginning. But in fact, stories do not start at the beginning. Storytellers make a choice about where they start their stories. The British writer E.M. Forster, I like to borrow from him what he said here. He said that if the king dies and the queen dies, then that's chronology. But if the king dies and then the queen dies of a broken heart, then that's the story. Now, if we began at the beginning, there would be no story, because we'd have the king alive and the queen alive, and there would be no broken hearts. So the storyteller decides where to begin that story. And my story is not a linear one. It doesn't begin with the secret. It begins with the secret's emergence as I learned of it. It doesn't begin with finding out that my unknown aunt spent 31 years in a mental hospital. That was the secret that my mother kept, that she had a sister she never talked about. Till I was in my 40s, I knew 3 things about my mom. Her name was Beth. She was an only child, and she always told me to tell the truth. Well, her name wasn't Beth, and she wasn't an only child, and her relationship with the truth turned out to be rather complicated. I had to decide where to start my story. It's the challenge of all writers. And how do we begin our stories? Often we begin with an emotion, or a motivation, or a justification, or a revelation. Because we aren't really trying to tell something chronologically. We're trying to tell the essence of our stories. It's always surprised me, though, when I get interviewed about Annie's Ghosts, I often get asked, why aren't you angry? That's where that person seems to want me to begin the story. It's a puzzling question to me, because it suggests that somehow the story is all about me. And while I write my book as a journey, I call it a journey into a family secret, and I do it because I think that I need to stand in for every reader who has a secret, every reader who has a family that's complicated, every reader who has something that's unusual. I mean, this is a universal story. My mother is every woman who had to decide what to do about having a sister who was so physically and mentally disabled that she ended up in an institution. Should she deal with that in the 1930s and 40s? My aunt is every woman who's ever been to a mental hospital in that era. But I had to decide how to tell the story. And anger was not where it started. I wanted to understand. I wanted to put myself back in my mother's shoes. I wanted to understand in 1940, when my aunt entered the hospital, what my mother was thinking that she would make it a secret. As you'll see, my mother told lies within lies about the secret. It's funny, when people ask me what my book is about, I tell them a little bit like I just told you, and then I shortcut it by saying, well, really what I did was I investigated my own mother. In newsrooms, there's a saying, if your mother tells you that she loves you, check it out. And the reason that young reporters get told that is to enforce the notion of accuracy. But I got to actually find out whether my mother was telling the truth about something. And that was quite a different challenge than I had ever had as a journalist. where do you begin an investigation like this? Why do you begin it? What is my motivation? All these things are things that I decided to talk about in the book. But the most important thing I wanted to get across here is that if I look at my mother's story through 2010 eyes, then I'm making a mistake, because that's not the story that happened. I have to look at the story through 1940 eyes, because that's how she looked at it. That's how my aunt's world seemed to her. And so putting yourself back 70 years in a time I did not live, this is before I was born, that's the challenge for the storyteller, the writer, the historians among us. So think about that. Think about that challenge as you hear the story. Secrecy and its consequences. I wanted you to think about what the meaning of secrecy is. We talk about privacy. Privacy is kind of a secret. I mean, you don't tell everybody everything about you, but a secret is something we would define it as telling no one. How many people here would say they have a family secret? Don't be shy. Raise your hand. Nobody has a family secret? A handful of people. Well, think that 15 years ago, I wouldn't have raised my hand either. Family secret is private, and every generation changes the reasons for secrecy. I mean, today, it's not much of a secret, I think, or much of a problem to tell people that there are mental health issues in a family. But in the 1930s and 40s, that was regarded as being shameful. Thank God that's not true today. That era, that was something you didn't really want to talk about, that you would keep private. And a lot of people that I met, I went back and found a lot of people who knew my mom in the 1930s. There was a kind of understood of silence that would go around people, where you didn't bring it up with them and they didn't bring it up with you, and you never talked about it. You never had to tell anybody. And one of my, I like most about the book is at one point my mother is sitting at a table where she's got 3 partners and they play bridge every week. And everybody knows my mom's secret, but nobody else knows that they each know the secret, because they all think about it in their own ways. And yet, when I interviewed the only surviving member, she said, well, I just knew I wasn't supposed to talk about it. I never brought it up to your mom. It didn't stop her from being angry about it, but that's the way she regarded it. So I would argue that if you take a coin and on one side is privacy, secrecy is on the other side. And not all secrets are bad. I don't want you to think that because I'm talking about secrets in this way that I think, oh gosh, every secret is bad. There are some good secrets. You'll see some of them as I go through my talk. But secrecy has a danger to it. It has a consequence to it. It can hurt people. It hurt my mom. I think she would have been a much happier person had she been able to reveal to people this secret that we only learned about at the end of her life. So I want you to think back with me, 1995, as Rebecca read, this secret begins in 1995. It emerged on an ordinary April afternoon. What emerged then was a lie. My mom was being treated in a hospital, and she was asked by a psychiatrist about some routine family history, and she said to the psychiatrist, I had a sister who was 2 years old when she was institutionalized, and I was 4, and I have no idea what happened to her. Unbeknownst to him, it was a secret. My mom didn't say, oh, I'm telling you something I've never told anybody else. He wrote it down in his notes, and unbeknownst to my mom, a social worker who knew her read the report and read those 2 sentences. Now, she did something after that you might argue was a violation of confidentiality. She made a phone call to my sister and said, does your mom have a sister? Why did she make this call? Because my mom, whenever she talked with the worker, would tell her stories about being an only child. And she was confused. And since my mom wasn't her client, and my mom wasn't being treated by the psychiatrist, there was kind of an air of murkiness about the privacy of these records. And today, the social worker who I interviewed will tell you that she didn't think she was doing anything wrong when she made this phone call, didn't even think about it. And she set in motion a series of events, including this book that my mom, I'm sure, would have loved to have had written. Anyway, the social worker didn't realize that what my mom said was a lie, because she didn't know anything about my mom, and she figured, well, now my mom's now revealing this truth. And so she asked my sister, and she repeats these two sentences. And then we did something that the journalists among you, the budding journalists, will not understand, which is that this investigative editor for the Washington Post doesn't ask his mother about this sentence, these two sentences. Why? Because she said, I don't have any idea what happened to my sister. And I thought, well, what's the point of upsetting her? She doesn't know anything about her. It never occurred to me, what should have occurred to me if I was in my realistic mode, that my mom was telling a lie. I thought, as the son, that my mom was telling the truth. Now, journalists know often that when people told lies start to reveal their story, their first set of facts are not the whole truth. But I wasn't thinking that way then. And so my mom dies in 1999, and she never did tell us of her own volition about her secret. What I know about my mom's secret I learned after her death. And why did I start to pursue it? Because 6 months after she died, the secret emerged for a second time. Unexpectedly, just as in the first case. We got a letter from the cemetery where my grandparents are buried, asking us if we wanted to have flowers planted on the graves for the spring. A routine letter, solicitation really, but it listed 3 graves and not 2. And finally, the secret had a name, Annie. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when you name something, when somebody becomes Annie as opposed to this unknown sister, that really changed things for me. I could imagine this person somewhat now, and I became much more curious about it. And I made a phone call to the state of Michigan because the cemetery record said that the performing party for her death was a state hospital. That gave me the understanding that this person had been institutionalized, was in a state hospital in Michigan. So I called Lansing, where the state capital of Michigan is, and I asked if I could find out anything about this Anna I had just learned about. And the answer from the woman who was quite helpful, who took my phone call, was you and 5,000 other people. And I was stunned by this. And I said, well, what? The institutions began closing in the 1960s and 70s. Why would 5,000 other people, of course, this is a figure she just plucked out of the air. There's no real number. Why would 5,000 other people be calling you up, asking about an unknown relative? And she said, I get dozens of calls a month from people just like you who have just learned about a secret relative in a mental institution. Well, as a journalist, I saw this as a universal story, not as an individual story. I mean, if there are that many families with secret relatives, then there are that many families that have the consequences of the secrecy that I'm talking about. Lest you think that this is an abstraction, I mean, think about all of the genetic issues relating to physical and mental disabilities that might be helpful to know today if you knew about them in earlier generations, or the generation skipping diseases. I got an email recently from a woman who told me about her father, who should have had a diabetic condition if this genetic condition existed in a generation skipping way. And he didn't have this disease, and so she was quite gratified to know that children weren't at risk of having this disease, until she learned that her father wasn't really her father, that there had been a lie to cover up an affair, she was the child of the affair, and that her biological father, when she tracked him down, did have the generation skipping disease. So that was very important in her family to learn that. Very important that the secrecy not cover everything up. I'm going to let you see some of the people I'm talking about. Where did the clicker go? Here it is. See if I know how to work this. I should have tested it. Not that one. So I've been talking about my mom. Let me show you my mom. This photograph is from 1943. She is, at that point, she is 25 years old. And I write in the book, my mother does not exist before 1942, because when I went to start the research for the book and I got together all of my mom's effects to look through them and sort of get a sense of what I was looking I realized that there wasn't a single document or photograph other than two. There were two documents and photographs from before 1942. How about yourselves? There wasn't a book, there wasn't a souvenir, there wasn't a stuffed animal, there wasn't a letter, there wasn't a journal, there wasn't a report card, there was nothing. Now you think, well, maybe his mother was just unsentimental, threw things away. That's why she kept 600 letters between my father and her in World War II. She kept a lot of things. She kept the scrawls of my 2-year-old kid that were hardly art and put them in a scrapbook. But she threw everything else away. I leave you to decide whether she did that on purpose. I love this photograph in part because as a writer you can just describe it. You can describe the cockney and the chaise lounge that she's standing on and the roiling sea behind her, and you can make up all kinds of things about what might have been going on there. Here's the only photograph she had of herself at 4 months old, taken in some studio on some weird rug. God knows why that was what she wanted to keep. This is the only other thing she kept, and this is when we discovered that her name was Bertha, not Beth. Now, I agree with you. I would change my name too if it were Bertha. I hope no Berthas are in the audience. Just not a name that we have in our time. There it is. Annie's a little harder to describe. I found no photograph of Annie. I wished I had, because the photograph on the cover of the book of two women is not Annie, and there would have been a photograph of her on the cover had I found one. And it sort of embarrasses me that they took a stock photograph and put it on the cover, but that's the publishing world. We can have that be the next lecture. Annie is somebody that I never met. She died in 1972. That's long before I learned of The Secret. She died at the age of 53. Let me tell you a little bit about her, just a very little bit. She was born with a deformed leg, never straightened out. At the age of 17, after years of casts and braces that made her go to school late, not until the age of 8, the leading orthopedic physician in Detroit decided to amputate her leg. Not sure whether that was a good decision or not. I think what his aim was to give her a stable platform on which to walk, because she had not been able to walk very well. So she was outfitted with a wooden leg, and that's the way she went through the rest of her days. She was slightly retarded, as the word was in those days, developmentally disabled. Her IQ scores were somewhere at the borderline area of about 80. And while we don't entirely trust IQ scores, were sort of consistent through time. She was tested, I found, 4 or 5 times in school. I got her school records. And she could read, she could talk with people. She was insightful enough to tell the social worker, according to the hospital records I eventually got, that she wanted to be normal like other children. She wanted to marry, she wanted to have a job, and yet she knew probably none of those things were available to her. So the writer's challenge is, well, how do you represent somebody you'd never talked to and you don't have a photograph of? This is how I learned of her existence. That's the cemetery letter, actually the invoice that I told you about. Interesting enough, it came to my mom. So she was getting something annually every year that was a threat to her secret. The address is a little bit misleading. It doesn't go to Massachusetts because she ever lived there. She lived in Michigan. That's my brother's address where the mail was being forwarded. The post office had told the cemetery that there was a new address. This is the petition, the court petition. At the age of 20 and 365 days, 4 days, the day before her 21st birthday, Annie goes to the mental institution. You'll see an alleged insane person. If that strikes you as being more of a criminal way of talking about somebody than a medical way, it is the way that era talked about mental illness. The proceeding for sending someone to a hospital against their will, what was called an involuntary commitment, was more like a criminal proceeding than a civil one. Patients, in fact, if you were a criminal, you had more rights than somebody who was alleged to be insane. alleged insane person, as in Annie's case, could be prevented from attending her own hearing on the say-so of the superintendent of the hospital, where most people were because an emergency had come up and they were already in the hospital. They did this not, I learned, because it was not good for the patient, but because the hospital was 11 miles away from the court, and it was expensive to transfer all those people downtown to have hearings all the time. So I discovered a form letter that said that my aunt was too sick to attend her own hearing. The letter was written on the day that Annie entered the hospital. The hearing was a month away. Surprising that the superintendent would know that she was too sick to go to that hearing a month later. Let me tell you a little bit about the hospital where she went. What I discovered when I started to pursue this was that Annie was not 2 years old when she went to the hospital. She was 21, as I said, a day shy of her 21st birthday. The other story was one that my mom just made up because it removed responsibility for anything from her, although she didn't make the decision to have my aunt go to the hospital. My grandparents made that decision. The hospital was called, as you can see from the cracked mug, Eloise, named after the Postmaster General's daughter's name, the Postmaster General of Detroit, who was on the board of the hospital from 1894 to 1906. And when they were hunting around for a new name for the asylum, they decided to call it Eloise to honor his daughter. And when you went to the hospital for many years, and even now in the building, the only building that survives out of the 75 that were there at one time, there's a portrait of Eloise with her St. Bernard at the entrance to the hospital. As I said, Annie entered in 1940. This is 1947, or 7 years later, and this is the typical female ward where she would have lived. You can count the number of bed frames there, total 7. You can see that there's no space between the bed frames, and this is the kind of privacy that somebody would have had in those days. There were lots and lots of people in mental hospitals at that time. Asylums were very large, not just in Michigan, but in every state that had a lot of asylums. Why? Because the theory was not the one that we have today. Today, the standard that we use is that someone needs to be a danger to himself or herself or others in order to be sent against their will to a mental hospital. In those days, there was a more benign paternalistic idea. We owe you, we the state of Michigan, owe you care and treatment. We owe our defectives, that's the word that was in the law. We owe our defectives care and treatment. Well, if you owe someone treatment, and you are getting better and better at diagnosing mental illness, and you're going to be sending a lot of people into those hospitals. And so they had to build more and more of them. Eloise was a county hospital, not a state hospital. The only county hospital in Michigan, and one of the few in the country, because in the early part of the 20th century, states decided that this was a state obligation, not a local obligation. So when she went to the hospital in 1940 and stayed until 1971, as I told you, she would have been in a room much like this, and she would have been, or she could have been on the floor, because it was so overcrowded that that's where some of the patients had to sleep. I don't think she was ever on the floor, actually. In 1946, they transferred her to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, 600 miles away from Detroit, because of the overcrowding there, and she was housed with 150 other people in a temporary army barracks, a former army barracks that was a temporary mental hospital. And they only sent her there because apparently she was healthy enough to go, because the people in the Upper Peninsula didn't want the worst patients, they wanted the best patients. So that gave me, as a writer, some clue about what they thought of her 5 or 6 years after she got into the hospital, because they had to write about her in this letter that they sent up to the Upper Peninsula. The newspapers at the time made a big deal out of this. That's why there's a photograph of it. This was a Detroit News photograph that I found in an archive. The people who were running Wayne County, which was the county that Eloise was located in, were very savvy about the photo ops that they created as they fought with the state over more money for the hospital. And so they would bring photographers into the building and take photographs to create an outrage about this. And it worked, for the most part. The problem was they were sending too many people, and it was too expensive. Now, anybody here know anything about the history of the mental health system in America? You know something about it? Well, you know, in the 1950s is when the revolution began that began to empty out our mental hospitals. And the revolution was caused not by a legal revolution, which is what we kind of think about, but by medication. 1955 was the first introduction of medication that allowed patients with severe mental illnesses to be treated at home. After Annie's amputation, she began to exhibit signs of paranoia and hostility, such to the degree that my grandparents said that they couldn't take care of her, and they sought help, and they were advised to send her to Eloise. In 1960, there became a kind of national debate about mental hospitals and why do we have them, why are they so large? And some people actually began to argue that there was no such thing as mental illness, that we were all on some sort of a spectrum, and some people are on one end and some people are on the other. And that led to a national conversation that created the foundation for the legal revolution, the lawsuits that said that hospitals were basically cruel places and people were being put there and kept there too long. Now, I actually think that this is not a correct impression, and I write about it in my book as not a correct impression of the system at the time. I think Hollywood has created this image, and I think it's done us a grave disservice, because what it does is to teach us that the past generations were cruel, inhumane, that there were lots of abused, over-medicated in that era, abused patients, over-medicated patients, people who were unable to have a conversation, who are heads down and they're drooling on themselves. That certainly happened. It was written about largely in the 1940s because conscientious objectors to World War II did their service in mental hospitals. And some of them wrote exposés after having served in the mental hospitals. And those exposés were, as I say, somewhat accurate. What's not accurate, though, is that they were cruel and inhumane people. Every generation, I would argue, every generation thinks that it's doing better than the last one. I mean, if you're living in 1940, then you're like us living now. Do we think we're doing a bad job? No, we think we're doing a better job. We think we're doing a progressive job. That's why we have all those people living under expressways with mental health problems. That's why most of our jails, 70% of the people in jail now have mental health problems. Why are they there? Because the mental hospital's closed, and people aren't getting services, and they end up somewhere. But we think we're doing better than the last generation, as that generation did of the generation before it, and on and on. And just to show you how things change, in 1949, the Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded to the man who developed the lobotomy, because they thought that was a progressive way to treat mental illness. Now, of course, we regard it as horrific and barbaric, but that's not what they thought. And it wasn't a private, closed procedure. People were having it. It was very publicly discussed, as were a lot of other procedures that have now been discredited. So the point of what I'm trying to say here is that if we get smug about the past, then we're not learning the lessons of what happened. 50 years from now, they're going to look back at our generation, and like every other successive generation, they're going to judge the predecessors. And they're going to wonder why we allowed people to be under the expressways and in jails at the level that we have. My grandparents, it's going to tell you a little bit about them. Immigrants from Russia at the time, not very well assimilated into the American society, unable to care for their younger daughter, sought help. This is the ship that my grandfather came over on. Sometimes writers are lucky, and I was able to find a photograph of the exact ship that he took his voyage on. This is a photograph taken in 1906. He came 6 months later on the SS Patricia. And I write in the book about the questions that you were asked when you came to the border included whether you were insane. Of course, if you said yes, then maybe you should be sent back. So people were immediately taught when they came to this country that you shouldn't reveal certain things. Now, of course, he had nothing to reveal at that point because he didn't have a daughter yet. But as I wrote, you got an immediate view of what this country thought about defectives. It was not something that if you had that problem, you weren't going to stay here. Here's my grandmother. As I write in the book, Annie was my mother's secret, not my grandmother. I learned that in her generation and among her friends, She didn't try to hide the existence of her daughter. There would have been no sense to doing it because Annie had grown up in a neighborhood. My grandmother still lived in that neighborhood. Who was she going to keep it a secret from? I love this photograph in part because of its tattered and torn nature. A little story about the publishing industry. When I sent this photograph to New York to be included among those that were printed in the book, they fixed it. They made it look like it had been taken last week. And I said, don't do that. That's a bad idea. One of the other major figures in the book is a woman named Anna, who is my mother's cousin, and who is my cousin, therefore, and who lived in the very town in Russia, later became Poland and Ukraine, where my grandparents came from. And she came to this country after the Holocaust, having survived the Holocaust by working for the Germans. She pretended to be German when she was Jewish. She bought some papers that gave her a new identity. This is the name that she adopted. Her real name was Anna Schlein, but she became Anna Propakovich, and for 4 years she pretended to be somebody that she wasn't. And in her case, of course, secrecy is how she survived. Secrecy, as I write here, lying was the route to survival, lying was safety. She had to pretend that she was German. Think about how hard that must have been for somebody who had lost their entire family in a massacre in the town where my grandmother came from. She had to pretend that she was German among the very people who had killed her entire family. She couldn't just pretend, she actually had to be German, because if you were ever caught, the consequences, of course, are death. As soon as the war was over, you can see down here, May of 1945. As soon as the war was over, she reclaimed her identity, Anna Schlein. All over the country, there are mental institutions with cemeteries next to them, because a lot of the public mental institutions were really the domicile for poor people. When those people died and either had no families, or their families didn't have any money or didn't come to claim them, they had to be buried somewhere. And so most cemeteries next to mental hospitals have markers like this with no names on them, just numbers. And as I write in the book, there are no names here, no identities. Why? Were they being cruel? No, it costs money to make a nice headstone with a name on it. But why do we memorialize people? Think about what we do with names. Names are really important to us. Numbers are not. Numbers are things you put on people's arms in concentration camps. Names are the way in which you honor people. So when I went to Ukraine, to the town where my grandparents grew up, and I went to see the mass grave where Anna had lost all of her family, I realized the connection between the cemetery next to Eloise, where the 804 was, and this cemetery. There are no names here either, no identities. You wouldn't even know it's a cemetery. You had to be told where to go. And up on the hillside there is a little monument that tells you that it is a mass grave, but it says that citizens are buried there. It doesn't say that they're Jews, because the Russians didn't really think it was important to tell the truth. They thought it was more important to enforce their ideology, which was that everybody's a citizen. I'm just going to put up a few slides and let you think about this, and then we're going to take some questions. Let me comment here. So in 1995, you remember I told you that my mom was being treated in the hospital. Well, let me tell you the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that she was admitted to the hospital to a psychiatric ward. The psychiatrist who decided that anxiety was her problem and not her emphysema, which was causing shortness of breath, which is how she ended up in the hospital in the first place, he thought she needed to have her medication monitored, because the medication he thought was best was a kind of respiratory suppressant. Had a slight risk. I mean, probably 3 out of 100 chance that it would cause a problem, But to be safe, he thought she should be monitored, and he was a psychiatrist, so that's where he had his practice, in a psychiatric ward. My mom voluntarily went, and the next morning at 7:30, she called me and told me she had made a big mistake. She could not stay here. She had to come out. Please come take her home. Well, of course, my mom wasn't taking care of herself very well. She was not eating well. Her apartment wasn't clean. I thought, with my sister, the two of us were kind of responsible at this point. My other siblings were not. I thought, well, this isn't a very good place, but if it's only going to be for a week or so, this is probably better than her being at home where she can't really take care of herself. Now, she was 78 years old at the time, and she was working, but she had taken this sort of downward spiral in the last couple of months. So I went there not knowing what to think, not knowing what I was going to do when I knew that she was going to beg me to go home. And she kept telling me that I didn't understand. I didn't understand that she couldn't stay here. Well, I understood. I mean, I could see around her that there were all these people who had dementia. It wasn't very hard to figure out why she wouldn't want to be there. What I didn't understand is that she thought she was becoming her sister, because I didn't know that she had a sister. I didn't know what her name was. I came to understand that my mom was terribly guilt-ridden by her secret, and that it was causing her a lot of anxiety and resulting in a depression. And the good news is that she only stayed there for 2 weeks, and she did come out, unlike Annie. She did go home, and she did return to work, and she had another 4 years of a fairly happy life until the end of her life. But she was very needy, and she was often asking for a lot of love, and I know that she would have been a happier person had she been able to reveal her secret. But having lived with it for 50 plus years, she was kind of stuck with it. She was locked into it. So that's why I think that when a secret would harm no one else, I mean, nobody else would be hurt if my mom had told me and her children about her secret. She just probably didn't want to be judged. She would have been a happier person. So at the beginning, my mom controlled her secret, but at the end, I think her secret controlled her. So I'm going to start off the question and answer by asking the first question. So Steve, has the book caused any problems in your family? Well, Austin, I can't write Running with Scissors. There was no psychodrama. Everybody was okay with it. Now that I've taken care of that question, are there any others? I'm going to call on somebody. This is a college, so don't be shy. Somebody has to have a question. Rebecca.
Were you ever able to find people that had gone to school with your mother or that knew Annie? Or
I found 6 people who knew my mom in the 30s and 40s. Of course, I was in a race against time because my mom, when she died, was 82. By the time I started doing this book, she died in 1999. When I started doing this book in 2005, it was 6 years later. So her set, she did have a couple of younger friends, fortunately, were in their mid-80s. But I did find 6 of them through all kinds of investigative reporting techniques that I never thought I would put into play in this way. Annie, I found people who did know or had met Annie. They didn't know her well because, as you can imagine, Annie was shunned in the neighborhood. So they saw her mostly from a distance, and none of the people I spoke to had ever had a conversation with her. And then about 3 months ago, I was at a talk in Michigan, and a woman came to the talk, and she pulled me aside right before the talk began, and she said, "I think I met your aunt." Of course, I was a little surprised by this, and she said, "I was 12 years old, and I was living on the grounds of Eloise Hospital. My parents were both psychiatrists there. And every day, for this one particular period of time, and it was only for that period of time, we would go to the soda shop. And this woman came in, and we knew she was a patient, and she said her name was Annie, and she was very talkative, and we got to know her a little bit. We were her 2 sisters and herself. And I started reading your book, and I said, oh my gosh, this must be the same woman. And she was very careful to say, I'm not really sure, but she thought so, and here's why she thought so. She called her sister up, and she said, do you remember that woman named Annie who said that, who talked to us at the soda shop? And my sister said, yes, she was the one who limped. That is, the wooden leg. She also said remember, she held out her hand to her ring finger and said, "I'm going to get married." Now, Annie was obsessed with getting married, according to the records. And this girl could tell, even at the age of 12, that this ring that Annie was holding out was a Cracker Jacks box ring. So she went home and asked her dad why someone would tell her a story like that, and her father just, I think, kindly said to her, "This is the woman's illusion, and you shouldn't disturb it. It makes her happy." So that was a big surprise to find her. And I've since gotten the names of other people who might or might not have known Annie. But unfortunately, I never found a photograph of her. I did find photographs of my mother in 6 different albums of other people's families. This was a great tool of investigative reporting. In fact, this one woman I pursued who would not, she was having a hard time in her life and she wouldn't go through her albums. She finally went through her albums because her granddaughter begged her to, after having found the book on her own, said, "Do you realize Grandma, her grandma, is in this book? Please go look at the photographs." And she had 75 photographs of my mom that I had never seen before. And this whole road trip my mom had taken in 1941, in which she went to the Catskills and the Poconos. I mean, this is a woman who had no money. I don't know how she and these 2 women afforded this. And the photographs showed my mom in the arms or laps of about 12 different men, which was a view of her I hadn't ever thought I might see. More questions?
If you, from a young age, when you could comprehend and you knew of any, would that have changed your outlook on life?
Well, I think my mom's motivation for keeping the secret had nothing to do with me, as I said, but I think that in the 50s, it probably had something to do with her children. She wouldn't have told people, her children, "Look, you have this mentally ill aunt." It would have been an upsetting thing to go see my aunt in this mental hospital. So I think she kind of thought she was doing me a favor, and in fact, I don't think it would have been very much, from what I understand of Annie at that time, she continued to have these paranoid symptoms. It wouldn't have been easy to go visit her in the hospital. I think it would have been quite upsetting to a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old. In 1972, I was 20 years old when she died. So, I have ambivalent feelings about whether I would have wanted to meet her. I probably wouldn't have seen her very often. And I know from Anna, the woman who is my mother's cousin, had a big fight with my mother over the secret. That's why I put her into the book. And you can see why the fight occurred. The fight was over a living person being hidden and a woman who had lost her entire family, so they saw the world very differently. The view that Anna gave me of what my aunt was like was a woman who wanted only to see her mother. She didn't want to even see Anna. And people speculated that one of the reasons why my grandmother was taking Anna, she asked Anna to drive her to the hospital. And one of the reasons why she was taking Anna there was to sort of turn it over to her. She saw her own mortality coming up, and she wanted to have somebody replace her. But Annie wanted nothing to do with Anna. So that didn't happen. I doubt that she would have wanted to have anything to do with me. So, mixed bag, I think, to have known her at that age. Somebody here had a question.
I really appreciate your comments and perspective on the history of healthcare in the United States and the place that
Thank you.
mental hospitals have had, and the very political nature of some of these different changes. And I wonder whether many of the students here realize that we live right next door to a very large mental hospital. And I actually had a student, you were talking when you mentioned connecting with the daughter of the psychiatrist who lived on the grounds. I had a student a few years ago who was the daughter of a psychiatrist who lived on the grounds of Spring Grove. That's another whole new world that perhaps some of you may want to investigate someday.
Well, the system that now exists for the services for mental health are mostly a community-based system. And a lot of people don't realize that the Community Mental Health Act was passed in 1963. John Kennedy was president and he signed the bill. And yet it was an unfunded mandate, as anyone knows what that term is from your poli-sci classes. And so it never really got going. And then Medicare was passed, and Medicaid in 1965. And today, the mental health system is largely a Medicaid-funded system. And that's one of the reasons why there are so many people who don't get services. The new mental health law, that was just, the new health reform law that was passed, has a provision for mental health in it that will change that. It broadens the qualifications for who gets Medicaid services. But a lot of men who had no families did not qualify for Medicaid under the law. And so they went without them, thus leading, in some people's view, it wouldn't lead to all homelessness, but some increase in homelessness. So this new law ought to change that a bit. And certainly, we don't have the same kinds of feelings about mental health that we did in my mother's time. I read a lot of magazines and the kinds of things I thought my mom might read to sort of see what kind of attitudes she might have collected from the popular culture about mental health. And first of all, you were being told constantly, you were barraged with articles that said it was genetic, which we know now to be sometimes true, sometimes not true. And you were also barraged with the notion that schizophrenia was on the rise in sort of an epidemic kind of proportions. There was one article that I read in, I don't remember whether it was Life or Look or something like that, and the title of it was, "Is Everyone Schizophrenic?" More questions?
Did you ever find out why there were no photos of your mother before 1922?
I never found anybody to tell me why there wasn't. I just think that, I know of no fire that occurred, nothing that would have caused it. I just think she got rid of everything that was a threat to anybody knowing about the secret.
Yeah.
But as a journalist, I'm very careful to say I don't know that. I don't even have one source for that, let alone two. Somebody had a question here?
You mentioned some clandestine journalistic investigatory skills that you put into practice to find out some information.
Well, let me tell you about the conversation with the woman in Lansing. It was a very interesting one. So I'm on the phone with her, and as you recall what I said, she said, "You and 5,000 other people." And I asked her, "What can you tell people?" And she said, "Nothing. State law prohibits me from talking about this kind of thing or finding any records out for you unless you have a court order." But then she proceeds, because she's quite a nice person, to tell me about how she helped this woman find her twin sister who had been institutionalized. And she feels so proud of what she did, which is that she gave her a Social Security number, she said. That's all she gave her. But that led the woman to find her twin sister, who had been, as I say, deinstitutionalized. And she had a photo on her desk of their reunion. Now, the journalist in me is listening to this, and I'm not hearing somebody who is unhappy to be talking to me. She's not trying to get off the phone. She's bragging about how, let's face it, she had violated the law. So I'm trying to think to myself, how can I get her to violate the law for me? So I ask her, well, no point in getting a court order if these records don't exist anymore. Would you mind helping me find out whether they exist? And my motivation there was, can I ask her a question that's going to make her feel comfortable, that's not going to make her feel like she's doing something that would get her in trouble? And she is the head of the records management agency for the state of Michigan at this point, so she's not a low-level clerk. I guess she has some authority to do this. So she said, yeah, I have a friend at Northville. My aunt was at Northville at the very end of her life for about 6 months. I'll call there and see if the records exist. And she called me back about, 2 weeks later and said, no, they've all been destroyed. You're out of luck. Well, at that point, it was the year 2000. I wasn't writing a book. I wasn't thinking I was just doing this out of curiosity, almost like getting into a new story and trying to find out what I could find out. But then a week later, I'd given her my fax number just in case, and across the fax, in those days it would have been fax more than email, comes the first 6 pages of Annie's admission to Eloise Hospital in 1940. And that's how I learned that Annie was 21 and not 2. I mean, I sat down, and I was so stunned by the date that I began to look for evidence in the admission record that this was like the 6th admission or something like that. She'd been cycling in and out of the hospital. The idea that it was her first admission, which it said very clearly it was not something I had expected, because I had believed my mom. I had been the son and not the journalist. So that's not exactly clandestine. I mean, I didn't mean to really give that impression as much as it was just sort of thinking quickly on my feet, looking for ways to find people. But the other challenge I had that was very difficult was, I learned about Anna, who I'd never met. I interview her. She tells me about this horrible fight she has with my mother over The Secret, causing a rift, which means I never met her. I never met her until 3 years ago. And I'm having this interview with her, and she's telling me this elaborate story about how she survived the Holocaust. The relevance of that, of course, is that this is where her anger comes from at my mom, so I want to understand this. And I'm dubious. I mean, how do I know she's telling me the truth? So I've got to gently and vigorously at the same time ask her to prove herself to me. So I just say to her, well, this is a very interesting story. Do you have any records that would show that you really, I didn't say that you really did this, but that really helped me understand the chronology of this? And she does have all these documents like the one you saw with the fake name on it. But even then, like while I was writing my book, there was a story about a woman who pretended to be a Holocaust survivor and had to withdraw her memoir because she had made the whole thing up. And I'm sitting there looking at what I'm doing and saying, well, maybe I should ask a few more questions. So I finally hired a German researcher to go to the German archives to make sure, not that her name was there, I didn't think that was necessary so much, but just to sort of get all of do sort of what you might call a sample check. Like she said she was with this unit. Does that unit exist? Did they exist at the time that she said that they existed in this place? And everything that she said checked out. The only problem was her memory. I mean, I'll tell you a story that I think is a really interesting example of memory. One of the things that I suggested I might talk about when Rebecca and I first corresponded was the question of memory and writing memoir. Because memories are faulty, and so are records. I mean, records aren't always accurate either. They're as good as the people who kept them. So you're always looking to try to balance out both things. But memory is, I think, changed by your life experiences. I'll give you a very simple example of this. Last year, some of you may remember this news story, there was a story about the discovery of a watch that Lincoln owned. And Anna's, her inflection, her demeanor, her body language. Was she stern or sad or nervous or demanding? None of the above, all of the above? When she was a taboo subject in her own house? Those news are beyond my reach. I cannot wrest them undistilled from Anna's memory. 50 years later, this cousin can do. So have just used the version they liked, if you were writing that kind. But I thought the story was much, as a writer, I turned that into a scene of Anna and why she would let you think about why she might have told two versions of that. I'd like to say that all stories have weaknesses. As a writer, my challenge is to make a strength out of the weakness, find the strength in the of what something is, what's going on, what's happening, and not try to make it all neat and pretty. I once gave a talk about edges. I think that's a good way to describe what the kind of memoir writing. I don't like stories that are all tied up neat and pretty. More questions?
Two questions related. When you're doing this research, did you have like a view change of your mom or your family, or more just researching like a journalist where it's most? And secondly, do you feel like an appeasement to the tension and the secrecy of kind of finally buried Anna or Annie?
You can't really describe her without changing your view of her. it, though, is that people. We can have more than one thought in our head. That's what makes us get into the food chain. And it's possible to see my mom as the liar, and also possible to see her as the kind and loving person. She was a really good mom, you know. She raised good kids, and yet she has this other side to her. And that, to me, is more interesting than, in my view, entirely in saying, oh, she's somehow some grotesque person. She wasn't. She was somebody who carried these two things with her. As for the appeasement, it's a word I hadn't thought about ever. Think about that. And I've been asked whether or not it brought closure in some way. Closure. I think we usually don't get there because it's too hard to reach. Instead, I think you just get to a point where you stand. I understand my mom and what she did. I don't know. I mean, I think she made a mistake for herself. I mean, she ended up guilt-ridden about the secret. But I certainly understand why she did it. And for a long period in her life, it was a better thing to have done. I don't know. Maybe it helped her get along. For the family, I don't think that, I think we see in our past and not in our present. There was much peace in Annie's life. I don't know how she spent her days, but I know how she spent her years. And her years were not probably very happy ones. But that woman I told you about who came to the talk, the reason I came tonight was to tell you that in my impression of Annie when I shop is that she was happy. Now, that may seem more than about Annie, because she wanted me to know that. It was a nice thought, and maybe it was even true. Question?
Yeah, to sum things up, what advice would you give to a student, someone who is trying to investigate their own family history?
Are you looking for advice that has to handle the family more, or the advice about how to actually do the research? There are lots of resources about how to do genealogy, which is what some of this is. Lots of techniques. I would. The advice I would really give you is of some people who do it, because they'll be delighted to help you. Get them to give you a little bit of a tutorial. But if you want to just experiment, and you have any sort of interest in either past generations and you know some information, immigrant information, if some of you have come from immigrant backgrounds, go to the library. You should go to the library right downstairs. They probably have it on Ancestry.com. It means it's free here. It wouldn't be free. And Ancestry.com has more records on it than you can possibly imagine. Pull up the census for years with your family's name, and if you know where they live, play around with it. I mean, it's actually sort of fun if you like that kind of thing. I discover all kinds of things. I mean, somebody was telling me about, you know, discovering a child that they had never heard about. Well, it might have been in census records, because I discovered that my mother's family was living with an uncle who I'd never ever heard of. My mother never talked about him. I discovered through this research that she had lived with him for 11 years, from the time that she was 6 to the time that she was 17. Now, that had to have a big effect on her. You don't in the apartment, small apartment, for that many years and not effect, but she didn't talk about that either. I think I know why. It's in the book. You know, that's the kind of thing you can own and just experience. If you like it, then keep doing it. But if you don't, figure out it can be frustrating and why you don't like it. And those are the two things I would say. Go talk to other people who know how to do it, or play around with it, because it's a cheap way to immerse yourself in that world. We have time for more questions? I mean, I'm willing to stay long here.
You hadn't talked about, and I'm sorry if this is a bad question, because I'm going to read it anyway, but you didn't talk about your dad.
Oh, someone would ask about my dad. Well, I don't want to give everything away. Less is. I'll just say that I should look the question about whether my dad knew. And I end the question about whether my dad knew. And I find along the way. I'm not going to tell you in which direction I change it. But it may or may not have anything critical to do with, you know, with the story. But it's still part of my journey. my dad know. I'm going to say. More questions?
So you started off by start. I was wondering to what extent having an idea of how you're going to wrap up the thing dictates at all.
Good last question.
Dictates at all where you're going to start.
Well, I think most writers would tell you that if you don't know where you're going by the time you finish your research, you probably ought not to start writing. I knew exactly where I was going to end. And make no mistake, this is a piece of art. All books in some ways are a piece of art. And I'm a writer to succeed as a piece of art. And therefore, I wanted to have an arc to the story. Same way I want to have an arc to the talk. I think you need to know where you're going by the time you write, although you don't always have to know the very end. I kind of knew where the end was in a literary way. I read some things where, people by Ian. See, I hate the ending of that book. And then I read an interview that said that he had written essentially the ending when he started writing the beginning. In other words, he had the idea of this old looking back upon her life. Well, then I understood the way it was, but I didn't like the ending. I thought it was contrived and forced. Often, I think novelists in particular sort of about, well, what if that was the end of somebody's life or the end of somebody's story? What's the story that got to that point? It makes perfect sense to me, a novelist, which I'm not yet. So yeah, I think it does very much help. I mean, as a writer, one of my things, a little bit of advice about all these budding writers, I'm sure. Writing a book is lonely. It cannot be otherwise. You can never keep anybody else up on who you are in your story or in your head. If you have a few close friends, you can bore them for about 10 minutes and say, I need this. But writers tend to find other writers to have coffee with, to trade stories, because it's the only way you can get kind of a social network going. And we've all heard people say, I love the research. I just don't like the writing. I don't think the writing that they mind much is that research, though, is a social activity. You're out with other people, and even if you're just in the library, you're doing, research. When I'm doing reporting, I'm calling people all over the place, and I'm having a conversation with them. That's fun. Sitting down alone at the keyboard is not so, might not be for some people so much fun. But I think that, a lot of people make mistakes because it's being, well, I'm going to write a 400-page book or a 300-page book, and it's monumental to me. I never thought about it that way. I knew that I was writing a chapter book, and that all I had to work on in any given day was chapter 7. I didn't have to work on the whole thing. I actually structured my deadlines. I mean, we've all read these things. I get up every morning, I write 200, then I have yoga, then I eat my yogurt, then I go back to words, and by the end of the day, I've got to write 700 words or else I feel like I didn't. I read those things and thought, oh great, every day I'm not going to get to 700 words. Or maybe I will in 3 days, but that means 3 days are failures. Well, nobody wants to fail 2 things. So I tried to figure out a way that I could be happy in doing this writing. So I decided I had to write a chapter every 2.5 weeks. And that way I can only fail every 2.5 weeks. But it gave me some flexibility, because then if I said to myself, well, I need to finish today, so that'll push my deadline back a day, or it's gone really well, I bought a day for myself. At least I feel like I'm making progress. I think all of us writers play tricks with ourselves. But I think in my case, it really worked. I mean, I turned my manuscript a month of the contract deadline. And of course, a publishing house, because they said, well, nobody turns in their book on time. And I thought I was late, because I was, by a month. But as a journalist, I had to have some deadlines. And when that 2.5 weeks came, if I can write more today, then I'll be closer to that. But that was just, I don't want to see it as monumental. I want to see it as stories that I'm trying to tell. And I have this huge whiteboard that I have in which I put all these scenes down that I didn't know where they were going to go. worry about it. One of the things that I learned about chapters into the book is that it will come to you. Scene will, you know, a good scene, you know it needs to go somewhere. It'll goes eventually. Don't worry it to death. And if it doesn't become clear, you belong in the book. Did you have a question? No. Questions before we close?
Please join me in thanking